Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning, I'm Jeff Kellam, your host today on Encounter. I'm the Parish Associate at the Union Presbyterian Church in Endicott. The first 25 years of my ministry, both education for ministry and engagement in ministry, were in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. I chose that seminary because it was close to Raleigh, where my parents had relocated from Endicott with IBM, but also because the seminary had a radio station. This Yankee, native New Yorker, finds himself then in the capital of the Confederacy. Walking along Monument Avenue, one of my churches that I served there was on Monument Avenue near the Lee Monument. Jeb Stuart, Robert E. Lee, the Civil War heroes who died in the Civil War faced defiantly north, they said, and those who lived for another day faced the homeland to the south. Just down the street from us was the Battle Abbey. And then around the corner from that was the Confederate Home for Widows. This was, or for needy women. It was established for Civil War widows and then daughters and then granddaughters. I did some services there for some of the people. I found myself very interested in Civil War history there, of course getting a different view of it than I had received in my education in New York. There was the White House of the Confederacy. There were churches there that were so proud that Robert E. Lee had worshiped here or Jeb Stuart had worshiped there. What people didn't talk about was the aftermath of the Civil War and the pain and the suffering of mental anguish and having lost the war, the cause, and the suicides that came as a result of the depression and that sense of loss. This is a difficult topic, and as we talk about this topic today, we're going to be putting on the screen for those who are viewing the program on television the phone number for the National Suicide Lifeline. And then I will be doing this verbally for the radio listeners, 1-800-273-8255. 1-800-273-8255, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. To the topic today. My guest is Dr. Diane Miller Sommerville, a professor of history at Binghamton University, who has written a book called Aberration of Mind, the subtitle of which is Suicide and Suffering in the Civil War era. Mm-hmm. Civil War South. Sure. Okay. Mm-hmm. What led you to this topic? As a professor of history, of course you're interested in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. You've spent some time in Richmond.
I did.
Yeah.
A lot of time.
Yeah.
Well, I think historians by nature tend to process a lot of problems, cultural events, political events, as we're seeing now, through the lens of the historian. And I don't remember the exact moment, but at some point I read an article or heard a story about mental depression and suicide, and I wondered how, if it's this difficult in the 20th century, how was it in the 19th century when medical doctors lacked the knowledge and understanding that we have in the 20th and then the 21st centuries? And as a Southern historian, it was only natural to turn and to pivot to the Civil War era, which for the South was the most traumatic event in its history. A second reason, I think, is that I'm a social historian, which means I'm really interested in the lives of ordinary people. And this was also a way to understand how war affected the average person, the soldier, his wife, a freed slave. All of these are covered in my book. And it took me into the archives, as like in Richmond in the Library of Virginia, into these obscure asylum records, for example, that had really not been looked at that point. And I was able to through those primary sources, be able to access lives of people who would be forgotten otherwise.
Yes. The term aberration of mind, where does that come from?
So suicide was actually, in the pre-modern era in Europe, considered a criminal. And if a person committed suicide in England, for example, there were penalties attached to the death, meaning that property would be confiscated, among others. And so there was this kind of loophole that was developed legally that if a person was not sane and not in a right mind, that if they had an aberration of mind momentarily, there would be an exception to that would help the family. And so that term kind of stuck and was applied mostly by lay people and in newspaper accounts to explain that this person, because there was such a stigma attached to mental illness and insanity, and so it allowed people to accept someone's death and not make judgments about them, and that were stigmatized.
Right, right. And the stigma remains.
Yes.
The idea that after the Civil War in the South, people had lost the war, but they had lost family members, they had lost land, they had lost their way of life. You know, and I don't want to, I don't want to sympathize too much with having lost the economy that had been based on slave labor, but we're looking at not the issue of slavery and the cause of the Civil War, but looking at the aftermath, because it has implications for us today. And I don't want to jump too far ahead in the book, but as we look, I noticed one of the reviewers of your book. Do you read the reviews?
I do.
Oh, I read one once of an article I wrote, and I've never read one since. Stephen Barry of the University of Georgia said, and this is a quotation from his review, "In recent years, the suicide rate among American soldiers in Afghanistan surpassed the rate of combat deaths, making work like aberration of mind enormously timely and important." So this is not just looking at history, but realizing that history does speak to us today.
It does, and in fact, I recently watched an interview with Lester Holt and Jason Kander, who was running for the mayor of Kansas City. He was a rising star in the Democratic Party in a red state, and he was a veteran of Afghanistan, and he abruptly dropped out of the race.
Yeah.
And it was he made the public announcement that he had been and was suffering from PTSD, and that he was taking time off to address that. And the interview was incredibly powerful because to me, it drew a line between what he was experiencing and what a lot of the soldiers in my book and veterans experienced as well. The anxiety and depression, of course, but also the hypervigilance and the startling, being easily startled. And then he talked about something called emotional numbness, so that your mind wants to shut down all of the negative stuff, but it also has to shut down all of the positive things. So, he was happily married and he had a child, and he couldn't experience the positive aspects of his emotional life. And I see so much of that played out in soldiers who end up in asylums or who were so traumatized that they end up killing themselves.
Yes. And the stigma was a social stigma in the community, but it was fed by often religious theology at the time.
Sure.
Can you describe a little bit of what you found there?
So unanimously across denominations, suicide was regarded as a mortal sin, and I'd never known why. I just thought it was because it's so bad, and it was because when you kill yourself, there's no opportunity to ask for forgiveness, and so it becomes therefore an unforgivable sin.
Yes, yeah.
And that all of the religious denominations adhered to this theology, even through after the Civil War, and that really drove the thinking about suicide before the Civil War, in the antebellum period. And I have many, many examples of people who say, I would kill myself except that it would be an affront to God. This is God's decision, not mine. And so they were very much informed by the religious explanation of suicide. During the Civil War, I argue that the suffering and suicide increases, although we can't get at the data because it didn't exist or it was burned after the war. But these people experienced unprecedented suffering and knew somebody who had killed themselves or had read about it because it was prolific in the newspapers. And I argue that they became much more sympathetic to accounts of it. And you can see it in the depictions in the newspapers, that there's a more of a compassion that's attached to suicides or news of suicides than there had been before.
So rather than anger, it was more sadness.
Right, like
pathos.
they're no longer contemptuous of people who kill themselves, because there was a lot of this person just wasn't patient enough. They weren't they weren't religious enough. And if they had been religious, then they wouldn't have killed themselves. That recedes, and there's more compassion and explanation and just a level of understanding that was unprecedented.
I remember reading the term, just buck up, in the last chapter of your book.
Sure.
And it's still prevalent now when people are despondent or are facing a depression. So many family members don't understand the illness of depression and simply say, well, just look on the bright side.
Right.
And we do want to hold out always hope. Hope is a great stimulant toward turning ourselves around in some way, but sometimes the darkness is, the shadows are just so heavy.
And I would say that in some ways, in women's diaries especially, because they were the ones who were writing a lot during the war and they were reflective, that religion was incredibly important to them and enabled them to get through it all, as I'm sure you know, it's a powerful support system. And a lot of the women who are writing actually, and this is one of the sources that I use to understand what their thinking process was. So I have a lot of women who survived and didn't kill themselves, but they talked about it. And one of the deterrents was, of course, the sinful nature of it, and they didn't want to offend God by taking the decision out of His hands and doing it themselves. But some of these women really wrestled with whether or not God would forgive them if they did commit suicide. And then I have another woman who was a widow at the time, and she was really struggling during and after the war. And she talks a lot about how wanting to passively die, which is a form of suicide, right? But she's I just wish I could die, and God won't remove this cloud over me. But she blamed herself for not being religious enough, and that being depressed in her mind was a symptom of simply not turning it over to God.
Yes, yeah. Our guest today is Diane Miller Sommerville, who has written a book called Aberration of Mind. It's about suicide in the post-Civil War South. And I want to give the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline throughout the program, because sometimes just talking about it means that someone might feel the need to reach out, both if they're contemplating suicide, but also if someone they know has suffered suicide. If you want someone to talk to, the phone number is 1-800-273-8255. 1-800 is easy to remember, but the 273-8255 is the Lifeline phone number. And if you go online there, you can also do a live chat. So we're looking at suicide as not from a psychological point of view, but we're looking at this historically now, but also theologically, because there were, you quote a number of ministers who were writing and preaching about the suicide after the war in the South. The Universalists took a different tact on this because they didn't buy into this God of judgment, nor did they look at hell as being the ultimate destination of someone who took their own life. So this created another voice.
It was a dissenting voice, and it was outside the mainstream.
Yeah.
But occasionally, actually, there was a big theological divide over this issue of suicide, and I would describe their position as being more modern and compassionate. And I have this case in the book where this young man in Virginia, he ends up after the war becoming a coroner in Richmond. He tells this tragic story of a man who he jumped out of a window and killed himself, and none of the local ministers would touch him, would bury him.
Yeah.
They denied him burial rites and a proper ritual. And this bothered some people. And finally, it was the Universalist minister who was going through town who said, I'll do it.
Yeah.
And he did it. And the observation of this man reflecting back was that this man was much more in keeping with the precepts of Jesus' teaching and showing compassion to this man, and that the other Christian ministers were aberrational in that regard, but were denying what Christ would have done.
Yeah, they are looking at a God of judgment rather than a God of grace.
Yes.
And that change that took place too after the Civil War and in was slow. It was slow to change.
Yes.
Because you experienced that personally with someone in your family who had committed suicide.
Yeah, I grew up in a Lutheran church in southwestern Pennsylvania, and my uncle probably 30 years ago, 25 years ago, took his own life. And his wife was very concerned that he would be denied a service in church. And the minister there said, no, by rights, by teaching, and by our theological doctrines, he should be denied the right to have a ceremony, but I'm not going to respect that. Yeah. We talked about this a little bit. Yeah. I don't know where the denominations stand today. I suspect that most of them have changed it, but it is still very much stigmatized in a lot of ways, but not to the degree that it was in the 19th century. Sure.
I just out of curiosity, the Presbyterian Church has policy after policy after policy. We meet it used to be every year. Now our General Assembly meets every 2 years, and during those meetings, we shape the theological policy and social policies of the church. And I went online today just to see what our policy was, and as late as 2018, the most recent General Assembly, and I'm sure this is not unique to Presbyterians. I think this is probably true of most of the mainline denominations. There is far more interest in helping people through this out of respect and out of sympathy rather than judgment. And a great deal of emphasis on suicide prevention. I think still prevention. It's in the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. We still want to help people deal with the depression and the anxiety and the very foundation of what leads them to make that decision of what was called self-murder. I'd never heard that term.
Yes. Yeah.
So, but to finish my point, there were about, 12 steps that churches were asked to take to talk about suicide, to talk about the aftermath, and to support families. And so it's a much more proactive healing process, I think, rather than saying, as apparently we did a century ago, we're not going to bury you in our cemetery.
Right. Probably the most famous suicide in this era in the South was that of Edmund Ruffin.
Yes, you know, that was fascinating. First and last shot, so to speak.
So Edmund Ruffin was an agrarian reformer in Virginia, and he was very well known outside the region. And he ended up killing himself after the end of the war, and a lot has been made of that because he was, in his note that he left, said he was not going to live under Yankee rule.
Yeah.
And that's been pretty much the focus of his explanation. But he actually wrote a very extensive, I think it was 13 or 14 pages of an explanation for why he committed suicide, and conceding that religion was a powerful influence. He went through the Bible, studying suicide, looking for places where it was forbidden, and he insisted that it was not. In fact, historically, he said, you know, the Jews in ancient times actually committed suicide, you know, rather than face surrender.
Yeah.
He found all kinds of examples of that. But he also said, very poetically, I'm no longer, I'm a cumberer of the earth. I am no longer capable of supporting myself, helping anybody, and therefore my purpose in life is done. And therefore I'm relieving my family of the obligation of keeping me alive, and I don't have any responsibilities. I've led a good life. I've contributed to a lot of good causes. But he very much was mindful of people perhaps judging him for doing this, and he wanted to make very clear that he felt that this was not sinful. He used the analogy of fasting and starving yourself, that when you keep food from somebody else, it is murder, but when you choose to do it yourself, it's your choice.
Yeah, that's the term cumberer.
Yes.
Is again, one of these old terms that we don't, but we talk about encumbrance, being weighted down, and this was a way to disencumber yourself and your family, and perhaps your community, if you felt worthless.
Yes.
And after the Civil War, again, if you are on the losing side, and I was also interested earlier in your book when you talked about some of these folks were plantation owners who had great properties and great family histories, but once they went into fight in the war, they're just another grunt alongside everybody else.
Exactly.
So they've lost already in fighting that lost cause. When this kind of turnaround happened in secular society among the coroners and sometimes the medical profession. It was slow to change theologically. When you get to the conclusion of your book, well, what conclusions do you draw?
That the cultural attitudes toward suicide had fundamentally changed, and that the Civil War played a really big role in that. That because of the vast amount of suffering that had occurred, everybody knew somebody who had committed suicide or had read about it in the newspaper, so they were more inclined to be compassionate as a result of that. The second thing is, and this is, we haven't talked about race at all here really,
right.
But one of the things that happens is that white Southerners begin to take this suffering and examples of suicide on as kind of a nationalistic badge that's fused with racial superiority. In other words, they had this collective sense of suffering that became part of their lost cause identity. And they were very much cordoning that suffering off from African Americans. So they had denied that African Americans were even capable of suffering depression because they were so simple-minded, and they did not possess wealth, and so they never had to worry about material possessions, and so they kept suffering to themselves. And for African Americans who clearly suffered as a result of the war too. They lost their homes, they lost the ability to have medical care and food, they had to find jobs. They suffered as well, and a lot of them manifested that suffering in mental illness and depression and suicide.
Yeah.
And it's what I note that's very interesting is that when you look at the diagnoses in the asylums after the Civil War, even those African Americans who come in and are clearly suicidal, they're never diagnosed with melancholy, which is the 19th century word for suicide. They're diagnosed as manic.
Wow.
Mania.
Yeah.
And that fit more with the cultural stereotypes of the African American as being animalistic and needing to be restrained in slavery.
Yeah.
And now we have this great fear that we're living through. And then the final thing I would say is that culturally we begin to see that suicide is celebrated. Most famously in The Birth of the Nation, where there's this young white woman who's being pursued by a black soldier. She jumps off the cliff rather than submit to him.
Yeah.
And so that becomes a celebration of suicide. And that's the exclamation point on my book.
Wow. Well, it is a wonderfully researched book. It took you how long to
14
write?
years.
14 years of research. And some of it probably not very pleasant, but a lot of it fulfilling a curiosity
Yes.
of your own as a historian.
Yes,
The book is called Aberration of Mind, Suicide and Suffering in the Civil War Era South. Diane Miller Sommerville, and she has been our guest today, professor of history at Binghamton University.
Yes.
So glad to see you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Here
I enjoyed our conversation.
in the seat. Once again, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline phone number is 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-8255. There's someone there who will be happy to talk with you if you have concerns about your own life or the life of someone you love. Again, Diane Miller Sommerville, our guest today on Encounter. I want to thank you for joining us. Encounter is produced by the Broome County Council of Churches. Our thanks to WBNG Television for the studio and for airing the program early on Sunday morning. And our thanks to the Town Square media stations for carrying Encounter each week. We hope to see you again here next week. And in the meantime, I hope that you'll be gentle with people and certainly with yourself.